Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! The bookshelf creaked as Adrian reached for a weathered tome on the top shelf. His fingertips brushed against the spine, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. The library's quiet atmosphere enveloped him, a comforting blanket of silence broken only by the occasional rustle of turning pages. "Hey, Adrian, you coming tonight?" A booming voice shattered the tranquility, causing Adrian to flinch and nearly drop the book. He turned to see his friend Mark grinning at him from the circulation desk.
"Keep your voice down,"
Adrian hissed, glancing around apologetically at the few patrons who had looked up in annoyance. Mark rolled his eyes good-naturedly.
"Come on, man. It's Tom's bachelor party. You can't bail on us."
Adrian sighed, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "I don't know, Mark. Parties aren't really my thing." "It'll be fun! Just us guys, having a few drinks, maybe some silly dares. Nothing crazy." The thought of silly dares made Adrian's stomach churn, but he knew his friends wouldn't let him off the hook easily.
"Fine," he conceded reluctantly. "But I'm not staying out late."
Mark clapped him on the back, nearly knocking the wind out of him.
"That's the spirit. We'll pick you up at 8.
As Mark sauntered away, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that he was going to regret this decision. Hours later, Adrian found himself crammed into a booth at a local bar, nursing a beer and trying to fade into the background as his friends laughed raucously around him. Tom, the groom-to-be, was already 3 sheets to the wind, his face flushed and tie askew.
"All right, boys,"
Mark shouted over the din of the bar.
"Time for some dares!"
A chorus of cheers went up, and Adrian felt his heart sink. He'd always been an easy target for his friends' pranks, his quiet nature and general awkwardness making him a prime candidate for embarrassment. Mark's eyes landed on Adrian, a mischievous glint in them.
"Adrian, I dare you to try on this dress!"
From seemingly nowhere, Mark produced a sparkly, emerald green cocktail dress. Adrian's eyes widened in horror as his friends hooted and hollered.
I can't,"
Adrian stammered, his face burning.
"Where did you even get that?"
"Does it matter?" Mark waggled his eyebrows. "Come on, it's just a bit of fun. For Tom's last night of freedom." Tom raised his glass in agreement, sloshing beer onto the table.
"Do it for me, buddy."
Adrian looked around the table, seeing nothing but expectant grins. He knew there was no way out of this without looking like a killjoy. With a deep breath, he grabbed the dress and stood up.
"Fine, but I'm changing in the bathroom."
Amidst cheers and wolf whistles, Adrian made his way to the men's room, his heart pounding. He locked himself in a stall and held up the dress, examining it with trepidation. It was clearly designed for someone with curves, not his lanky frame. With fumbling fingers, Adrian stripped down to his boxers and began the awkward process of shimmying into the dress. The fabric clung to him in all the wrong places, and he struggled to pull the zipper up his back. After what felt like an eternity, Adrian managed to get the dress on. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the stall, avoiding his reflection in the mirror. As he reached for the door handle, he felt a sudden resistance. The zipper was stuck. Adrian's heart rate spiked as he twisted and turned, trying to reach the zipper. No matter how he contorted himself, he couldn't get a good grip on it. Panic began to set in as he realized he was well and truly stuck in this ridiculous dress. Taking a few calming breaths, Adrian steeled himself and opened the bathroom door. He'd have to ask one of his friends for help, as mortifying as that would be. The moment he stepped back into the bar, a hush fell over his group of friends, followed by an explosion of laughter and catcalls. Adrian's face burned as he shuffled over to the table, acutely aware of the stares from other patrons.
I'm stuck,
he mumbled, turning his back to Mark.
The zipper won't budge.
Mark's laughter died down as he tugged at the zipper.
Shit, you're right. It's really jammed in there.
For the next hour, Adrian's friends took turns trying to free him from the dress. They tugged, pulled, and even tried using butter from the kitchen to lubricate the zipper, all to no avail. As the night wore on, their amusement turned to concern. Maybe we should call a locksmith or something, Tom suggested, his words slightly slurred. Adrian shook his head vehemently.
No way. I'm not explaining this to a stranger.
As the bar began to clear out, Adrian realized with growing dread that he was going to have to leave wearing the dress. His clothes were still in the bathroom stall, but there was no way he could put them on over the skin-tight garment.
I'll drive you home,
Mark offered, looking genuinely apologetic.
We'll figure this out in the morning.
The ride home was excruciating. Adrian hunched down in the passenger seat, praying that no one would see him. When they pulled up to his apartment building, he practically sprinted inside, calling a hasty goodnight to Mark. Once in the safety of his apartment, Adrian collapsed onto his couch, exhausted and humiliated. He stared down at the glittering fabric stretched across his chest, feeling a strange mix of emotions he couldn't quite place. As uncomfortable as the dress was, there was something about the way it hugged his body that felt right. Adrian shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. It was just the stress of the situation getting to him. He spent a restless night on the couch, unable to lie comfortably in bed with the unyielding fabric constricting his movements. When morning came, Adrian called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of explaining his predicament to his coworkers. As the day wore on, Adrian found himself studying his reflection in the mirror more and more. The dress, while ill-fitting in some areas, accentuated parts of his body he'd never paid much attention to before. His slender waist, the gentle curve of his hips. A knock at the door startled Adrian out of his reverie. He opened it to find Mark standing there, a guilty expression on his face.
Hey man, I brought some tools to try and get that zipper unstuck.
For the next few hours, Mark tried everything from pliers to WD-40, but the zipper remained stubbornly jammed. As frustration mounted, Adrian found himself growing oddly accustomed to the feeling of the dress against his skin.
I'm really sorry about this, Adrian,
Mark said, wiping sweat from his brow.
I didn't think it would turn out like this.
Adrian surprised himself by smiling.
It's okay. I mean, it's not ideal, but I don't know. It's kind of interesting, in a way.
Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. As he packed up his tools, he hesitated.
You know Tom's wedding is tomorrow, right? Are you still planning to go?
The wedding. Adrian had completely forgotten. He looked down at the dress, then back at Mark. A wild idea began to form in his mind.
Yeah,
he said slowly.
I think I am.
Mark's eyes widened.
You mean, in the dress?
Adrian nodded, a strange sense of excitement bubbling up inside him.
Why not? It'll be a great story, right?
After Mark left, shaking his head in disbelief, Adrian spent the rest of the day preparing for the wedding. He found an old pair of dress shoes that somewhat matched the gown and practiced walking in them. He even experimented with some of his rarely used hair gel, styling his normally unruly locks into a softer, more feminine look. As he worked, Adrian found himself thinking about all the times in his life he'd felt out of place, uncomfortable in his own skin, how he'd always gravitated towards quieter, more traditionally feminine pursuits like reading and gardening, how he'd never quite fit in with the rough-and-tumble boys he'd grown up with. For the first time, Adrian allowed himself to consider the possibility that these feelings might mean something more. The next day, Adrian arrived at the wedding venue with butterflies in his stomach. He'd called ahead to explain the situation to Tom and his bride-to-be, who had surprisingly taken it in stride. As he walked into the church, he felt every eye turned towards him. But instead of the mortification he'd expected to feel, Adrian found himself standing taller, embracing the attention. The dress, which had seemed like a ridiculous costume yesterday, now felt like a declaration. Throughout the ceremony and reception, Adrian fielded questions and jokes with a newfound confidence. He danced, he laughed, and for once, he didn't feel like he was playing a part. The more he leaned into this new persona, the more natural it felt. As the night wound down, Adrian found a quiet moment alone with Tom.
"I have to say, Adrian,"
Tom said, his words slightly slurred from champagne,
"you're rocking that dress better than half the women here."
Adrian smiled, a warm feeling spreading through his chest.
"Thanks, Tom. You know, this whole experience has been eye-opening."
Tom nodded sagely.
"Sometimes it takes something crazy to make us see what was there all along, you know?"
As Adrian made his way home that night, still clad in the now famous green dress, he felt like he was standing on the precipice of something monumental. The zipper that had once felt like a trap now felt like an invitation to explore a part of himself he'd long ignored. In the days that followed, Adrian threw himself into research, reading everything he could find about gender identity and expression. He joined online forums, tentatively sharing his experience and finding a community of people who understood exactly what he was going through. Weeks passed, and the dress remained stubbornly stuck. But Adrian no longer minded. In fact, he'd grown quite attached to it. He'd taken to wearing it around his apartment, reveling in the way it made him feel. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as Adrian was watering his plants in the dress, that he heard a soft pop. The zipper, after weeks of unyielding resistance, had finally come unstuck. Adrian stood there for a long moment, water still trickling from the can in his hand. Then, with trembling fingers, he reached back and slowly, deliberately, zipped the dress back up. In that moment, Adrian realized that the person he'd been all along had finally emerged. The dress hadn't trapped her. It had set her free. As she looked at her reflection in the window, Daniela smiled. The journey ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely herself. The next day, Daniela walked into the library with her head held high. She'd swapped the cocktail dress for a more work-appropriate outfit, but the confidence it had given her remained. As she approached the circulation desk, she saw Mark's eyes widen in recognition.
"Adrian?"
he asked, then quickly corrected himself. "I mean, Daniela," she supplied, smiling warmly. "It's Daniela now." Mark nodded, a look of understanding dawning on his face.
"Daniela,"
he repeated, testing out the name. Then he grinned.
"It suits you."
As Daniela settled into her usual spot behind the reference desk, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The library, with its endless stories of transformation and self-discovery, seemed like the perfect place for her to begin this new chapter of her life. Throughout the day, Daniela fielded curious looks and questions from her coworkers and regular patrons. Some were confused, others supportive, but she met each interaction with the same quiet strength she'd discovered within herself. During her lunch break, Daniela found herself in the library's gender studies section, a place she'd always been curious about, but had never dared to explore before. As she ran her fingers along the spines of books detailing the experiences of transgender individuals, she felt a surge of emotion. "Finding everything okay?" a voice asked behind her. Daniela turned to see her supervisor, Mrs. Patel, watching her with a gentle smile. "Yes, thank you," Daniela replied, fighting the urge to hide the book she'd been examining. Mrs. Patel's eyes flickered to the title, then back to Daniela's face. "You know," she said softly, "the library has always been a place of learning and self-discovery. I'm glad you're finding the resources you need." Tears pricked at Daniela's eyes as she nodded gratefully. "It means a lot to hear you say that." "Take all the time you need," Mrs. Patel said, patting Daniela's arm before walking away. As the weeks passed, Daniela's transformation continued, both internally and externally. She began to experiment with makeup, started growing out her hair, and gradually introduced more feminine elements into her wardrobe. Each small change felt like a step towards aligning her outer appearance with her true self. Of course, the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were awkward moments, misunderstandings, and occasionally hurtful comments. But for every negative experience, there seemed to be a positive one to balance it out. One particularly memorable moment came when Tom and his new wife stopped by the library to return their honeymoon books. They did a double take when they saw Daniela, but their surprise quickly turned to warm smiles. "You look amazing!" Tom's wife gushed, reaching across the desk to squeeze Daniela's hand. "That dress at the wedding was just the beginning, huh?" Daniela laughed, feeling a rush of affection for the couple. "You could say that. Thank you both for being so understanding about the whole situation." Tom shrugged, grinning. "Hey, you made our wedding unforgettable. We should be thanking you." As they chatted, Daniela realized how far she'd come from that night at the bar. The person who had been so mortified at the thought of wearing a dress in public now stood confidently in her own skin, embracing her true identity. Months flew by, and Daniela found herself preparing for another wedding, this time, Mark's. As she stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the strap of a beautiful blue gown she'd chosen herself, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her to this point. The doorbell rang, and Daniela opened it to find Mark standing there, looking dapper in his tuxedo. His eyes widened as he took in her appearance. "Wow, Daniela," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "You look incredible." Daniela felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thanks, Mark. You clean up pretty well yourself." As they drove to the venue, Mark glanced over at her. "You know, I've been meaning to tell you. I'm really proud of you, Daniela. The way you've handled everything, how true you've been to yourself. It's inspiring." Daniela felt a lump form in her throat. "That means a lot coming from you, Mark. You've been such a good friend through all of this." Mark chuckled. "Well, I did get you into this mess in the first place with that dare. Least I could do was stick around for the aftermath." As they pulled up to the wedding venue, Daniela felt a moment of déjà vu, but this time, as she stepped out of the car, head held high in a dress she'd chosen for herself, she felt nothing but pride and joy. The wedding was beautiful, filled with laughter and love, Daniela danced and celebrated with her friends, no longer feeling like an outsider looking in. As the night wore on, she found herself by the bar, taking a moment to catch her breath.
Having a good time?
A voice asked. Daniela turned to see a tall woman with curly hair smiling at her. Absolutely, Daniela replied, returning the smile. I'm Daniela, friend of the groom. Emily, the woman said, extending her hand. I work with the bride. As they chatted, Daniela felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with the champagne she'd been drinking. Emily was witty and kind, and Daniela found herself drawn to her warm brown eyes. When Emily asked her to dance, Daniela hesitated only for a moment before taking her hand. As they swayed to the music, Daniela marveled at how natural it felt to be held in another woman's arms. The night ended with Emily's number in Daniela's phone and a promise to meet for coffee soon. As Daniela climbed into a taxi, her cheeks flushed with excitement. She couldn't help but marvel at how far she'd come. From a quiet librarian trapped in a dress and his own insecurities, to a confident woman embracing all aspects of her identity, it had been quite a journey. And as Daniela gazed out the taxi window at the city lights blurring past, she knew it was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Daniela's life continued to evolve in ways she never could have imagined. Her relationship with Emily blossomed, bringing a new dimension of love and companionship to her life. At work, she spearheaded initiatives to make the library more inclusive, organizing events and curating resources for the LGBTQ+ community. 1 year to the day after the fateful bachelor party, Daniela found herself back at the same bar, surrounded by her friends. But this time, instead of feeling out of place, she was the center of attention for all the right reasons.
To Daniela,
Mark toasted, raising his glass.
Who taught us all a thing or two about courage and being true to yourself.
As cheers erupted around her, Daniela felt tears prick her eyes. She looked around at the faces of her friends, Mark, Tom, Emily, her co-workers from the library, all beaming at her with pride and affection. Thank you all, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for accepting me, supporting me, and loving me through this journey. I couldn't have done it without you. Later that night, as Daniela and Emily walked home hand in hand, Emily turned to her with a mischievous glint in her eye. You know, she said, I've always wondered, whatever happened to that green dress? Daniela laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet street. It's hanging in my closet, actually. I keep it as a reminder of how far I've come. Emily squeezed her hand. Maybe you should wear it again sometime, for old time's sake. As they reached Daniela's apartment, she paused at the door, a smile playing on her lips. You know what? Maybe I will. And with that, Daniela stepped into her home, ready to face whatever new adventures life had in store for her. The dress that had once seemed like a trap had become a symbol of her transformation, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected experiences can lead us to our truest selves. As she closed the door behind her, Daniela felt a sense of completeness wash over her. She was Daniela now, wholly, unequivocally, and joyfully herself, and she wouldn't have it any other way.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!